This is Millom! This is Millom! This is Millom! This is Millom.
This is Millom. This is Millom.
This is Millom. This is Millom.
This is Millom.
This is Millom. This is Millom. This is Millom.
This is Millom. This is Millom.
This is Millom.
This is Millom.
This is Millom.
This is Millom.
This is Millom.
This
This is Millom.
This
This is
is
Millom.
This
This is Millom.
This is
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 This is Millom.
This is Millom. Mind the gap between perception and reality.
I think it keeps you sane.
Do people say it's working for you then?
Oh, not a good example. Have you heard of Wim Hof, the Iceman? He's an advocate for cold water immersion to make you feel better. I've just been reading his, doing with some Wim Hof breathing and getting some cold immersion therapy.
That's got to be 2 minutes. You're turning pink, you know that?
Probably, yeah. Expect it would. Is that enough?
Yeah, oh please do. Don't wait for me.
I came to Cumbria 12 years ago specifically to swim in the lakes. So I think swimming, getting in cold water regularly does help.
Oh, it had a notoriety because before the track was laid, we were notoriously famous for our thick mud. Because of that, it got a reputation of being one of the slowest in the country, despite being one of the flattest in the country. So obviously you've got more drag. It's not like running on tarmac or anything, it's just going to be very sapping. A little while ago, BBC Radio 4 heard about our track being so slow, considering it was very flat. They couldn't understand why that was happening, so they sent this guy down and his producer, and he ran round and he discovered why. Because it is so muddy, it makes for slow times, and it just stops people running fast. We managed to get a lot of funding through a lot of efforts through the committee and from Park Run and from England Athletics, but it took a lot of effort from the local people that help on this park run, and because of that we've now got a proper track following the route where it went when it was muddy. I was actually timekeeping at the time in the middle of the field, so it went round the school field, and then it veered off into the middle of the school field for the finish. People wondered why he was here. Obviously he ran round, he chatted to the runners as they went round. Well, there was a big puddle at the end because of obviously the pounding of the feet coming through the finish. He loved it so much he chose to do a swallow dive through the finish, spraying water everywhere. We're starting to get more people because they know they can run a fast time. I mean, there's a lot of bends in it, but it is very flat and it is very fast. It's probably one of the fastest because it's a track, proper made track for running them.
Yan, Tian, Tethera, Methera, pimp, cethara, lethera, hoverer, dovra, dick, yanadic, tianadic, tetheradic, metheradic, bumfit.
Usually grateful wet and cold, and yeah, it's very, very well received, and that keeps us going because we quite often get funding from those people and friends and family. So, because we're totally independent, we raise all of our own money, so we don't get any backing from the government or our allies. So we rely on people like that to fund us. Fuel is one of our main costs at the moment. On a day like this, if we're out for an hour, about 80 quid's worth of petrol in the boat, petrol in the tractor. We have insurances to pay, and believe it or not, the council makes us pay council tax. So we've lots of overheads before we even start. We're all volunteers. Everyone, all of our supporters, committee, people that do the maintenance and fundraise for us, are all volunteers. Yeah, so there was a death of a local youngster, and the village decided to fund and set up a lifeboat, and this is where we are.
Can you just repeat that over?
Yeah, on the plotter that's forward, there's an MOB, like an event button. If you press that, it might give you a mark on the plotter where to start your search from, over. Average rescue, average base, over.
Average base, average rescue, over.
Average rescue, average base, just position and intentions of it. In the 70s, when we were initially set up, that would have been the ideal scenario. The RNLI established a station here, but for whatever reasons they saw, they didn't need to. Most of it is a tidal range, as you probably know. The tide can be in, like it's fully in now, and then in 6 hours' time it's fully out. And if people don't understand when the tide's coming in and going out, they can be in the wrong place at the wrong time, basically. I think we've rescued getting on for 300 people now, in the last 50 years. We had our 50th anniversary last year, so yeah, it's been worth it, because they had to build the boathouse, they had to acquire a tractor, the boat, find a crew, and yeah, it was before my time, but I would imagine it was very intensive. I've always been involved in the sea, at work and in my hobbies, a natural thing to do, plus it's in the family line as well. My uncle and my father, the founder members.
The iron ore from Hod Barrow was extremely high quality, perhaps the best in the world. High quality was important in the Victorian era since it reduced the amount of coke needed. At Hod Barrow the hematite was so good they even made jewelry out of it. Cumberland furnaces needed about a quarter less fuel thanks to the high quality of the iron ore. The original seawall was built at huge cost in order to allow the extraction of iron too far under the Duddon estuary to be safely mined. In 1898 seawater and sand invaded the mine. This cracked the inner barrier, so the outer barrier had to be built. It was much bigger, over a mile long. More significantly, it had a degree of flexibility that the inner barrier lacked. The building of the new wall required 1,200 men and used more than 620,000 tons of limestone. Everything was done on a huge scale. Completion was in mid-April 1905, and the price tag was £560,000, something like £40 million or more at today's prices. The new wall led to one of the most productive periods in Hod Barrow's history, with output never falling below 500,000 tons a year from 1905 to 1909. At the time, Hod Barrow produced half of the iron ore mined in Cumberland. From 1909 output fell, though output grew during the First World War, when the Ministry of Munitions ran the mine. Post-First World War, Hod Barrow had a difficult time, and in January 1921 it closed completely for a while. There were no orders. Operation resumed later that year, but it was patchy. Even so, the brave decision to sink a new shaft at Moor Bank was made, and this was completed in 1928.
1889 was the peak year for the manufacture of steel using the Bessemer process in Britain. From then on, the iron industry in West Cumberland declined. Despite a few blips, Notably during the World Wars, the decline proved to be terminal. Mas X, the ironworks managing director, was well aware of the threat. Speaking to striking miners in 1889, he said,
"The Middlesbrough people have succeeded in making basic steel out of the worst ore in the world, and it has pretty much ruined the works of this country."
Borwick Rails, described as a natural harbour, became a major transport hub with its own pilot ships and the arrival of vessels, schooners, on almost every tide. In the 1880s it was reported that there could be perhaps 30 or even 40 ships moored close to the pier. Ships would often take iron to South Wales, then coal to Ireland and return with wood to make pick props for Hodbarrow. Thanks to constant dredging of the Duddon, captains could expect 12 or perhaps 13 feet of water in high tide at a Hodbarrow pier. Just 4 pence, about 2 pence in new money, had to be paid to the lord of the manor for the use of the pier. The sand obtained from dredging was vital for the ironworks. Nothing was wasted. The schooners were very robust, they had to be to cope with frequent grounding in the harbour and carry the dense and heavy hematite. They were certainly sturdy, but many were still lost at sea. One story told in Millom was set in November during a gale. At the pier a young captain was about to go out to sea with his wife and son on board. They begged him not to go. He would never make it. But he was determined. They never saw him again. Outsiders don't understand the Duddon tides.
The family originated from Cornwall and come up here when the ironworks opened. Nearly all of Millom worked there. It was the only spot really, besides Sellafield, that had jobs for people, local people. Yeah, my dad did. He was a chauffeur there. My Auntie Pat worked there and all. She was a secretary. My great-granddad did that cross on the top of St George's. And then he did the one on the seawall.
From the hill of Millom, we would look down, it would be about a mile and a half as the crow flies, and they used to tip, I think it was slag, they used to say, out, and there was a real orange glow that lit up the sky. Obviously it grew bigger, and then it just diminished back down to nothing, but we used to sit there, or stand there as kids, or go out in the garden and have a look at it, because it was just a marvellous spectacle.
As you go around the roadway, you could see it shining. What a glow of it. It was marvellous. Now, as a kid, you never thought out of it. But when you look at it, then it was always late at night. And especially in winter, you'd see it shining bright red as they emptied the iron ore onto the, well, what was shills and that of it. It was unbelievable. They used to track it right from the ironworks, and it used to go right down, and they'd store it where the old railway is now.
Dynamite is surprisingly safe and stable. The miners would bore 6 holes. The dynamite was shoved in and then blasting caps, or detonators. Amongst the last mines to be sunk was a drift mine at Haverig, 90 fathoms deep and troublesome. In 1935 there was a big break-in, water flooded the working mines at Hodbarrow and the miners had to run for it. The water was pumped out a few times, but it always came back. So the decision was taken to open up a new shaft. But it was not an easy thing to do. The ground had to be frozen to make it safe to work. The spin-off benefit from the point of view of the kids was that when they went past, perhaps on their way to school, the miners gave them lumps of ice to suck, very welcome in the summer sun. There were injuries and even deaths, but Hodbarrow was regarded as quite a safe mine because unlike coal mines, there was no gas. In 1959 the Cranley Group bought the ironworks and soon began building a blast furnace capable of producing 5,500 tons of iron a week. The ironworks celebrated its centenary in 1963. All the workers got a pearl-handled penknife. Prospecting for new deposits of iron continued until 1965, and a sinter plant, moved from Barrow to Millom, was commissioned in 1967, just a few months before the closure of mines and furnaces.
During the First World War there was a short-lived boom in demand for pig iron from Millom ironworks. It turned out that it was especially useful for the production of armour plating. But demand collapsed after the war, so that by 1921 Millom ironworks had been damped out and Hodbarrow was closed for the immediate future. Virtually the entire working population of Millom was unemployed. Rabbits often formed a big part of the diet in Millom. All the miners would go to the gardener and rabbit catcher at Hodbarrow to buy rabbits. He could catch perhaps 100 a day and would skin them before selling them. Millom had a rag and bone man who wore a bowler hat and a swallowtail coat, green with age. He paid the gardener half a crown, 12.5 new pence, for 2 rabbit skins. But the gardener didn't get any of the money. He had to give it to his bosses at Hodbarrow.
A company, the group of miners at a four-breast, the area of iron being worked, had to pay for dynamite, detonators, fuses, candles and lamps. Earnings were based on the amount of ore extracted. This was partly the tonnage and partly calculated by the underground foreman, the captain. The result was described as the bargain. The title captain was not the only nautical term used at Hodbarrow. The depth of the works was measured in fathoms rather than yards or feet. The captains all wore moleskin suits, almost as if it were a uniform. At one time every parish had its mole catcher who would supplement income by selling the pelts. It took about 500 pelts to make a coat. The unique property of moleskin is that you can stroke it both ways and the fur stays smooth. This adaptation may be useful for travelling along burrows, hence the captain's interest in the fur. Since there was no gas in the mine, there was no need to go to the expense of getting the safety lamps used by coal miners. At Hodbarrow they found there was some rather fine blue clay at the end of the seawall, and many of the miners used this to attach tallow candles to the hard hats they wore underground. They always took several candles down the pit even though they had carbide lamps. Bait, lunch, usually came in a circular tin that could be shoved into a pocket, along with a metal bottle containing plain tea. The tea was heated by a candle, with the bottle and candle fixed into a pit prop. One common staple was what they called Cousin Jack, a potato pasty. This probably reflected the Cornish heritage of many of the miners. Other popular dishes included jam sandwiches. The jam might be made from blackberries picked by the kids in the area currently occupied by the lagoon, the RSPB sanctuary. But if they were picking blackberries, they might have to look out for a keeper working for Hodbarrow, who patrolled the area with a stick and would boot out anyone he found. During the Second World War it was possible to pay a small amount for a permit to pick blackberries, and the money raised went to Red Cross. Kids growing up near the ironworks treated the area as an adventure playground. There were newts and frogs, you could go crabbing or fishing, or take the railway rolling stock for a half-mile ride. Dangerous but enjoyable. Sometimes laying down after bait. A miner would feel something running over him. A rat. At Hodbarrow rats were not universally regarded with horror. Walking down the shafts to seaward, as they called it, miners would encounter big rats. Eventually they got used to them and some even started to feed the rats like pets. One time as a group of miners approached the face, there was a terrible smell. Dead rats. Someone had poisoned them. The captain was enraged and said if he found out who'd done it he'd sack them. Perhaps it was that nautical connection again, the idea that rats leaving a ship was a bad omen.
The miners didn't have baths or showers but had what they called drys. This consisted of a wooden tub they called a dolly, perhaps 18 inches or 2 foot square, in a long room fitted only with taps. They stood naked with a bit of water and washed the thick off. Safety helmets, hard hats, were provided by the company. Under the helmet they wore a little cloth cap. Their hair was tucked into the cap and it was awkward or uncomfortable to wear. Sweat poured out of them throughout the shift. The miners' clothes were red with iron and it took weeks to get the red out of their skin. After working a shift, 8 men would crowd into one of the cages, the lifts hoisted by the winding gear. When the first sight of light was seen the cry would go up, "Sunlight!" The iron ore was blasted from the forebreast, but after that everything had to be done by hand. The bogies were shovel-filled and then moved by human power. There were no pit ponies. The miners were the pit ponies. The barrows, known as bogies, could take a great weight, perhaps half a ton. But if they were properly balanced, you could push them with your little finger. One newcomer who was told to load half a ton of iron onto a bogie asked if a person was going to have to move it. He'd worked on a farm and knew you wouldn't expect a horse to move a burden like that. It all depended on how it was loaded. Balanced properly and it was easy to move. Throw the ore in any old how and it was impossible. Hodbarrow Mines accident book from 1920 to 1935 has survived. You can view it at the Archive Centre in Barrow. The youngest miners to have their names entered are Harry Atkinson and Stanley Rowe, both 14. The oldest was Thomas Letcher, 78. Most of the entries sound fairly innocuous, hit by timber or by rocks falling from the mine roof. But since these were tough blokes and they often had a month or so off work to recover, the injuries were probably more serious than they look on paper. Some of the accidents cannot be played down, because they were horrible. Some too grisly to mention. There are also oddities like bursitis, miner's elbow. And there are deaths, but if these occur a little while after the actual accident, the book authors seem to be at pains to avoid admitting guilt. There was no way to dodge responsibility for the Hodbarrow disaster of April 1933 when 3 young men, apparently well known and popular in the community, were killed in an explosion. Dynamite was used to extract the iron, and this is a pretty stable and safe type of explosive. It's only dangerous if you fix a fuse and light it. Most of the Hodbarrow mine complex was shut in 1933 because it had been flooded with water and sand. But Moorebank Mine, where the disaster happened, continued to operate. Captain Thompson, captains were underground managers, had advised the miners to shoot light, presumably use less dynamite, and fit extra props. Captain Davis, who was in the mine when the deaths occurred, said he thought 2 explosive charges may have gone off simultaneously since the staging and the top of the ladder were damaged. This should not have happened if the charges had fired in sequence. The dynamite was typically placed in perhaps half a dozen holes drilled into the rock and timed to explode one after the other. Even in 1933, using fuses for blasting was considered old-fashioned. At the time there was what might have been a safer method, electric firing or battery ignition. An inquest was told the men died instantly during the blast. The surnames on the screen are those of the 600-plus miners featured in the 15 years the book covers. Many of the surnames are still present and well known in Millom today.
The first Cornish beam engine was installed at Hodbarrow before 1872. It could pump an amazing 280 gallons of water a minute. Miners described the output as greater than the Lazy, the river flowing into Port Havrig. One beam engine was not quite enough. 3 more followed, each much larger than the original. In 1876, a beam engine built by a company called Harvey was located in the number 5 shaft, the Arnold. In about 1879, a magnificent beam engine made by the William Perrin Foundry was installed in the Annie Lowther. The Perrin beam engine was a showpiece. It had originally been built for a trade exhibition in India. It was such a good machine that 30 years after it was installed, when it looked like it was going to be engulfed, the Cornish company John Tomkin and Son was brought in to save it. They managed the job just in time. It continued to operate until 1959. The third beam engine, dating from 1899, was yet another Harvey, possibly because the Perrin company had not survived long after it built the showpiece machine. In the long run, this Perrin and the Harvey worked in tandem, sharing both chimney and boilers. The Harvey on the Arnold, the one installed in 1876, was destroyed in the collapse of the shaft in 1938. Cornish beam engines were superseded by electric pumps, but the new technology did not work quite as well as the old, at least at first. This was because sand or slurry was sometimes more than half the mixture being pumped. The steam pumps could cope with this by removing all weight from the balance box, and then attaching several tons of chain to the main pump rod. This cheat, called flogging, had been tried and tested in Cornwall. It worked in the most difficult of circumstances. Miners thought that working on the beam engines was the best job. They were regarded as more reliable since the electric pumps didn't always cut in.
Treatment of electric shock. A person apparently dead may be revived. Remove the body from contact with the wire, cable or other conductor by 1. Breaking or disconnecting the circuit. 2. Dragging the patient away by his coat tails, the hands being protected by India rubber gloves or any dry woolen material such as a cap, folded several thicknesses if possible.
No one could understand why one of the pumps was not retained as a museum piece after the closure of the mine in 1968. They were wonderful things.
At Borwick Rails in the 1930s, the kids would be sent outside to look any time there was a plane in the sky. It was such a rare event. When a Zeppelin was sighted, probably in 1937, it seemed to go directly overhead and very close to the ironworks. One of the kids remembered Mr. Geldred being there at the time and him saying that thing is spying on Barrow. He was only a joiner in Hodbarrow, but he knew. Mr. Geldred built the air raid shelter at Steel Green and he was killed in the air raid there. On the 2nd of January 1941 the sky was lit by the bombing of Barrow. In Millom the red-hot slag had been tipped next to the sea wall and was still glowing. One of the German bombers, on the way back from Barrow, seems to have spotted light reflecting on the windows of the houses at Steel Green, from the glow of the slag. The Germans dropped bombs right on top of the houses. One 9-year-old in bed at the time reported waking to find one of the walls in his bedroom had disappeared. The roofs had collapsed into the back street and there was no front street left. A gas main blazed. Soldiers arrived. The 9-year-old thought he heard a child under the rubble calling out for his mother. A soldier stopped him from climbing the rubble to scrabble underneath. It was simply too dangerous. Lord Haw Haw, the propagandist who broadcast regularly to the UK on German radio, was believed to know Millom well. His mother Gertrude Brooke was born in Lancashire. On the night of the Steel Green bombing, he claimed that the ironworks had been hit. During the Second World War, Millom had an elaborate routine designed to deal with the threat of German bombing. As soon as the air raid siren sounded, everything at the ironworks that could be switched off was switched off. It was impossible to turn the heat of the furnaces off, but the blast, the combustion air blown into the furnace at pressure, could be extinguished. The effect was eerie. Instead of the deafening noise, everything went silent. You could hear a pin drop. Time, it was said, seemed to stand still. Since vessels were coming from abroad, a hospital capable of isolating those suspected of bringing diseases with them was built at the Hodbarrow Mains. After the NHS was set up, the foreman blacksmith lived in what used to be the hospital. His family remembered using the morgue as a larder. It had cold slabs useful for storing milk. The blacksmiths or farriers were important people at Hodbarrow. Horses performed all the heavy work until mechanical power came along. They even pulled a snow plough in severe winters. There were 8 fires at the blacksmith's shop, enough to keep a large team ringing the anvils. For some reason the mine favoured Clydesdales, large horses that were reasonably common in Scotland and northern England. The smiths would do small jobs for the local community, perhaps repair a garden fork or make a shovel. They took no money for this, but the custom was that a small gift, perhaps a cabbage or carrots, would be left in exchange. There was a sawmill at the mine, to cut the pit props to the proper sizes. The blacksmiths would take the off-cuts to the old in the town for use as firewood.
The noise made by the ironworks was constant, clanking, banging and ringing all day and all night. One Millom lad who used to live close to the works had problems when he got married and moved 3 miles away. He couldn't sleep. It was simply too quiet. The sinter process is used to combine iron particles. At Millom, if the process was not finely tuned, the whole town was covered with a fine dust. Worse was when they used soda ash to boil the sulphur out of the iron. The more sulphur, the more soda ash. This pumped poison over the town if the wind was blowing that way. If it blew up Newton Street, you couldn't see a hand in front of your face. It was a highly localized smog that took half an hour to clear. Throughout that time, people in Newton Street knew not to open their front doors. At the ironworks, men working on the furnaces wore clogs because shoes would not long survive the fiery conditions. Clogs were safer partly because they had corkers or clog irons. But there were limits to what you could do with them. If the corkers connected with the molten iron, the corker would explode away from the red-hot metal. The furnaces produced carbon monoxide, a toxic gas. The symptoms of low-level poisoning were similar to drunkenness. A small amount would make a man feel tipsy, he might fall over. Large amounts would knock him unconscious. Some got burnt by iron, some by sand. If you smelled burning flesh, the memory stayed with you. The men who worked on what they called the front side of the furnace were always coming home with burnt clothing. It was impossible to avoid the sparks. At the ironworks, the rule was you had to wait for the arrival of your replacement, someone who did the same job as you on the next shift. If you were on the shift that ended at 10 p.m. and you were friends with the man who was taking over from you, he might arrive half an hour early, perhaps even an hour before 10 p.m. The reason for this was that all the pubs in town shut at 10 p.m, so an early switch over let the blokes get out in time to have a pint or two or three. In the early 1950s, pay was £0.50 an hour. That worked out at 12.5 pence or £1 for an 8-hour shift. If the person who was expected to take over from you failed to turn up, you had to work a double shift. Pay rate £2. There was no premium for overtime. The foreman would send out to get you a tin of bait. The ironworks had a powerful union, a closed shop, but industrial discipline was fierce and often arbitrary. If you were out of order, you were gone. When two blokes got into a fight, they might be grassed for a week. By grass they meant sent home without pay. But there were also moments of kindness, as when one manager sent down to the Devon, a nearby pub, to get pints all round since the men were working stripped to the waist shovelling coal because the automatic system had broken down.
I'm David Bradbury. Way back in the late 1960s, probably about a year after the Millom Ironworks closed, my dad and I paid them a visit. We were on holiday in Eskdale. The whole family was on holiday in Eskdale. And so Mum and my sister went off in one direction and we went off in the crazy other direction towards these old, almost about to be ruins in Millom. We arrived at the site entrance and there was a caretaker chap on duty who said, yes, you can wander around as the site is completely derelict, but try not to get yourselves damaged in any way. So we just spent a whole afternoon exploring every nook and cranny. We even went into some of the buildings and just huge, great things, very impressive scale. You know, everything was really big, the blast furnace, the cupolas, that sort of thing. And the ancillary buildings that we wandered into, just massive, several stories high. But also, of course, there was the impression of dereliction, I suppose you would have to say. Although most things were still basically intact, everything was clearly unused, grass growing where it shouldn't and all that sort of thing. So it was sad, but tremendously impressive. It was amazing to see a whole complex all interlinked. You know, so the iron works was there because the iron mine was there and so on. And yeah, just amazing to explore and to try and grasp the significance of everything. Well, there was a definite impression of somewhere that was dying or dead. You know, you couldn't avoid the fact that the place was coming down, but at the same time you could see that it had been pretty epic when it was working. There is one photograph, a wooden tub sort of thing with handles, exactly the right shape and size for a coffin.
This could be the coffin, carried by women who the Daily Mirror described as the fighting wives of Millom. The paper said 8 women carried a coffin in protest at the closure of the ironworks. They marched from the works gates to the council offices and were followed by 50 women and children. The Mirror said there was a confrontation between some of the men and the fighting wives, the men objecting to the protest. A local councillor tried to make a speech but was shouted down by the crowd and the police moved in. The photo was taken by David Bradbury, who was a teenager at the time and visited the site with his father when the ironworks was being demolished. David knew nothing of the fighting wives, but he was struck by the unusual object, believing it looked like a coffin. Perhaps it was. If so, the wives were tough, since it looks pretty heavy.
5 Millom housewives carrying an empty coffin fought their way through a barrier of angry workmen in a mock funeral procession. An effigy hanging from the top of a 150-foot-high blast furnace cooling plant symbolized the bitterness of the townsfolk. The incident took place an hour after the town's chief industry, the Millom Hematite and Iron Company, had closed. The housewives staged the march from the iron works to the town square as a protest against the government's failure to solve the imminent problem of the town's industrial crisis. More than 400 men from the iron works were made redundant yesterday afternoon. They had originally planned to hold the mock funeral, but as one of the organizers, Councillor Leslie Sawrey, explained, the men were allowed to go home at 3 o'clock, which was earlier than expected. Consequently, many of the men went off to some of the clubs in town. They never turned up for the march. I can only say we are grateful to the housewives of Millom who have come forward to carry on this demonstration. Some of the workers, however, were strongly opposed to the idea of a funeral. Shouting, "We are not dead and we are not burying Millom," a line of men blocked the road in front of the marching women, who were led by a man, Mr. Alan Butcher, dressed up as an undertaker. A melee developed in which the Union Jack shroud was snatched from the imitation coffin, while workers struggled with the women. The housewives, Mrs. Evelyn Park, Mrs. Hester Harris, Mrs. Veta Swarbrick, Mrs. Lydia Walsh and Mrs. Mary Cosgrove, managed to struggle through the barrier. Still carrying the coffin, they marched towards the market square. There, hundreds gathered to hear speeches about the crisis into which the town had been placed. Mrs. Park said, "I was absolutely disgusted by the behavior of these men in the road. But we battled through. We are not burying Millom." Mrs. Harris said, "We are burying Millom Rural District Council for doing nothing about the town." At the iron works, large sections of the plant were being taken down as negotiable stock. The plant has closed through the failure of its parent company, Cranley Group, to win government sympathy for the development of the spray steel making project at Millom, and through the firm's inability to compete with imports of cheap pig iron from Russia. Councillor Sawrey expressed fears that other local factories would suffer from the closure.
There was a demonstration on, a big walk through the town, and the mention of Harold Wilson being involved, obviously the Prime Minister at the time, I would imagine. And the only thing, real thing that I think of was when my dad was finally made redundant, him coming home with a bundle of money in his hand, throwing it up in the air, and as kids do, there was 4 of us, you're clamouring, trying to catch it, and, laughing and giggling, and not having a full understanding of the consequences of why that money was there. We're only kids, and I can remember whatever time of the year it was, it must have been obviously after September 1968, whereby a gentleman who my dad knew and was a Millomite, he'd got employment up in Workington, to the side of the world at that time, I can remember him coming down to where we lived at 41 Albert Street with a gentleman with a collar and tie on, and having some discussion with my dad, and then soon after he'd gone, and he was on a 3-month probation and stayed with my Uncle Trevor at Wathbrow, rather than him commuting all the way from Millom to, he did have a car at the time, so how he managed to get from Wathbrow to Workington, that I don't know, I'm afraid.
The wooden coffin story is probably just that, a story. According to the Newcastle Journal, the coffin was really made of cardboard boxes, stuck together to look like a coffin. The journal had it that the men harassed the fighting wives, tearing the coffin to pieces. The women then reassembled it and held it together, using the flag that had been covering it.
My dad, who works at Millom Ironworks since he started serving his time there, following him doing his national service, and he worked there for quite a number of years until it sadly closed down in 1968. But my dad was a pattern maker and an extremely superb craftsman. He made moulds out of wood, or patterns out of wood, different shapes. They would go into machinery filled with sand, and it would make a mould. The sand would be released, or the mould would come out of the sand, and then the molten metal would be poured into where the wooden structure was, and whatever shape that was, out came a steel one, the same shape, size, obviously a lot more weight, but that's what he did. I don't know, I can remember watching my dad, playing football. I believe he was reserve goalkeeper. I can remember watching him at Bootle vividly, at the football ground at Bootle and at the Ironworks. Whether this is true or not, I really don't know, but I have it written down that my dad was the manager, the secretary and the treasurer, all at the same time, and in one season they won 3 trophies. And whether he was the man there, I'm sorry, maybe it's just pure speculation, or I don't know, but I've been told that, and it's in the memory banks forever, I'm afraid. Yeah, it was a very good team, and again, I'm only going by the photos of 3 trophies in one season, and I'm thinking that I've heard that they were unbeaten all season, which is quite an accomplishment. So I'm kind of proud of that, if he was who he said he was. Absolutely loved it. Absolutely fascinating. There was the egg and spoon race that we all took part in, the sack race, tons of other stuff, 100 yards dash or whatever it was. Never a good runner. And then they used to release, as they still do today, hundreds of balloons into the air with the labels on that you wrote your name on, and they would be found wherever, and they would get a prize up. I don't know how it worked, and I can remember my granddad. There was a small shed-like building on the field. He used to dish these prize packets out. They were like a small brown paper packet-sized envelope. What was in them, I can't remember, but I know my granddad was. He did that kind of thing. Yeah, wonderful days of hundreds of people there.
Apart from the slag bank, the only obvious evidence left of the site's industrial history is the plug or bloom. This solidified molten iron is all that remains of the last blast furnace. Known as Number 1 Furnace, it had only started working in 1960 and was by far the largest furnace on the site.
What did make a noise, I remember, was the fire siren, or the bombing siren that used to go off, I think, at 7:20 on a Monday. They just tested it, and it went woo, and died away like that.
The year after the closure, so many took their money out of the local co-op that the society stopped allowing withdrawals. The Millom co-op was later liquidated. And it did not end there. BBC's nationwide TV programme picked up the story about the Millom Co-op, and this resulted in a run on the Co-op Building Society. Lincoln Co-op saw £100,000 withdrawn as a result of the scare. Overall withdrawals totalled 9%. In 1970, the Co-op Building Society left the Cooperative Union and changed its name to Nationwide.
I'm Jan Bridget, and many years ago, in 1965, I joined the WRAF. I was in the RAF for 6 years, till 71, And when I was at Spitalgate, RAF Spitalgate, which is where you do your basic training bit, in essence, you're there for 6 weeks, and if you can survive that training, you can survive anything, because you're like up at 5 o'clock in the morning, bulling your shoes, cleaning your buttons and your hat badge, and doing a kit laying your kit out for inspections and learning to drill. But you were in a room, and there were about 11 other women in the room, and so you got friendly with people, and there were 3 Welsh girls that I became really good friends with, these 3 Welsh girls. And I don't know how it came to be, but we started talking about, I think, hypnosis. And I happened to have an interest in medallion that my cousin had brought me back from Greece. So I said, well, okay, let's have a go. I've got this medallion. Let me have a go at hypnotising one of you. So I did. I sat there. We're sitting on the bed, and I was going with the medallion, and I was saying, "You're a snowflake. You're up in the sky, and quite a quiet voice. And as the snowflake falls from the sky, you're going to go into a deep sleep." And I just kept on repeating that, and then stopped. And by gum, it worked. It ended up. I was terrified. She was, "Bye, are you there? Bye." Couldn't wake her up. I forgot to say when I flick that, or when I clap my hands, you'll wake up. I forgot to do that. Well, I'd never done it before, so I didn't know that you had to do that. And we all had to go trying to wake her up, and we couldn't wake her up. And we ended up contacting the camp medic, the MO, the medical officer, and he came to see her, and he said, "She'll wake up in 24 hours and it'll be fine." But the next day I got called up in front of the WAF office, the WAF G, the big cheese, and got a right bollocking. And I thought, I've only just joined up, and I'm going to be thrown out before I've even finished my basic training. That was it, really. That was the story. Except that we said to Vi, "What was it like? Where were you?" And she said she was in this really like a dark cave, and it was all damp and quite scary. And that was it. But I was terrified. I thought I've not killed her, but I've put her into this deep sleep and I can't get her out again. I was really petrified. I never tried it again because it was too scary that it worked. What we did used to do, but when I went to the next camp, RAF Bordsey, is we used to get involved with a Ouija board. You know, where you put your letters round and you have a glass and you all put your fingers on and you ask it questions and there's a yes and a no. And that terrified me even more, frankly.
I was interested to see the different types of animals, the sheep, different colours, and cockerels and chickens that you don't normally see as you're going around. But also, my sister, Catherine Gray, had a pony, and our neighbour, they, as girls, had ponies, and their father was able to take them to the Millom show, and they did some show jumping there, so we went along to support them. Oh, I think my greatest claim to fame was that I entered the Boys' Pets in the early 1960s and I won first prize. It was a white mouse, would you believe? Well, I got a couple from the pet shop in Millom, which is still in the place that it used to be in 1960, and male and a female, and I had a very big mousery. It was a big blanket box that I had constructed the insides of, nest boxes and runs, and I bred the white mice just for fun. Well, actually, I couldn't stop them breeding. It is a very traditional show. It's got the main ring, and there are things you don't see, well, I don't see very often. Fancy dress, rider and horse, the parade of old tractors, which is fantastic, and the care and the joy that the owners have and the pride they have of showing these vehicles. As well as, of course, all the livestock, sheep, bulls, heifers. I didn't get there this year till about 12, just after 12, and I was there were 2 fields of cars, so assuming there are at least 2 people on average per car, and walking around this year, we were blessed with good weather. I don't know what the attendance figures are, but I'm sure it would be many hundreds, possibly over 1,000. It's quite an attraction and a draw for local and not so local people.
We're very fortunate. We live on Salthouse Road, and we have a house which has a hedge, and the hedge is right in front of our front room. We have a seagull. He comes across to me and looks in the window as if to say, I'm hungry and I want something to eat. And so we find some bread. He loves macaroni cheese, and he takes it all usually, but sometimes he leaves crumbs so that the sparrows can eat those. So, so he's not always greedy. It just depends. He was brought up by hand. Snowy, we call him Snowy, and Snowy decided he would come to where all the commotion was going on in my front garden, and he decided that that was where he could come as well. So, but he's the boss, and if he arrives, the others disappear for a while, and then they come back to see what is left. He's on the main road, so not a lot of people, only our block, and they all seem to take to him, and they feed him as well. So he's not alone. But it's usually mine because of the hedge, really, because he can actually sit on the hedge and look at me. We're not sure whether he was male or female. So some give him a lady's name, some give him a man's name, I think. But we decided Snowy was in between, so it could be either. Well, yes, you can't help but like him, really. He's very tame. He just takes out of your hand, and if my dogs arrive and look at him, he just looks back. He doesn't fly away or anything. So he's very tame.
Bumfit, Methradik, Tethradik, Tianadik, Yanadik, Dick, Dovra, Hoverer, Lethera, Sethera, Pimp, Methera, Tethera, Tian, Yan.
Right, when you're ready.
So I'm going to walk down to the bench.
And then walk back.
Turn around and walk back.
Thank you, yes.
Okay, you've got to put the test. Do you want me to wait?
No, do it now.
No, anyway.
They're very kindly walking round.
Okay, right.
Thank you.